Hello dear students, today we are going to talk about language and speech. Now what is language? Language is way of communication through sign and symbols, way of communication between two individuals or multiple individuals or to each other through sign and symbols in the form of written words and spoken words. Written words or spoken words. So what is language? Language is way of communication through sign and symbol in the form of written words or spoken words. Now speech has two types, written speech and spoken speech. Now we do have two hemisphere, left hemisphere and right hemisphere. Our left hemisphere is dominant hemisphere, whereas right hemisphere is non-dominant hemisphere. And for right-handed person, left hemisphere is dominant and right hemisphere is non-dominant. Whereas in left-handed person, 80% of left-handed person, left hemisphere is your dominant and right is non-dominant. So that's why left hemisphere is also called categorical hemisphere and right hemisphere is called representational hemisphere. Right hemisphere is concerned with your emotions, musical awareness, three-dimensional awareness, art awareness, and drawing. And left hemisphere is concerned with your mathematical skills, reasoning, verbal skill, and many others. So when you speak through the left hemisphere, it is your verbal communication. But to the verbal communication, if the right hemisphere adds emotion to your verbal speech, it gives quality to the speech. Okay, in layman language, speech only means spoken speech. But in medical term, there are two types of speech, written speech and spoken speech. Now, how speech is developed and which areas are concerned with the development of speech. Okay, main landmark in the cerebrum is central sulcus, postcentral gyrus. This is your precentral gyrus. This is your postcentral gyrus. This is your visual cortex, area number 17, 18 and 19. Primary, secondary and tertiary visual cortex. Secondary and tertiary visual cortex is also called visual association area. In the same way, in the temporal lobe, there are three gyruses, superior, middle and inferior temporal gyruses, which are concerned with your primary, secondary and tertiary auditory cortex respectively. And here at the frontal lobe, superior, middle and inferior frontal gyrus. Now at the back of superior temporal gyrus, there is an area which is called Wernicke's area. And at the back of inferior frontal gyrus there is another area which is your Broca's area. Now Wernicke's area is your area of comprehension and interpretation, whereas Broca's area is your area of speech expression. Now both these areas, Wernicke's area and Broca's area, they are connected through a bundle of neurons, fibers. That is called arcuate fasciculus. Okay, now two areas, Wernicke's area and Broca's areas. Wernicke's area is area of comprehension and interpretation. Comprehension means understanding. Basically, Wernicke's area is your verbal dictionary. Whatever you learn in your childhood up to now, all this learning through written words or spoken words, they are stored in our Wernicke's area in which hemisphere? Dominant hemisphere. Whereas Broca's area is the area of speech expression. Okay, now recently two more areas are identified. They are called, okay, one area which is posterior to Wernicke's area, that is called Jarin's area. And another area near to Broca's area which is called Exner's area. Now, when I write something, okay, let's say suppose I write down horse. So this visual information, horse words, they carry through visual impulses, through visual pathway to the primary visual cortex, area number 17. This visual information is received in the primary visual cortex, area number 17. Then this visual information communicate with your secondary visual cortex. This secondary visual cortex is concerned with the analysis of visual information. Let's say suppose this is standing line or horizontal line or curved line. All this information is analyzed in secondary visual cortex, and this secondary, after analysis, this secondary communicate visual information to tertiary visual cortex, where these words are recognized, which is H, O, R, S and E, based on the past experiences. Tertiary, recognize. Okay, area number 17 receive visual information, area number 18 analyzed visual information, and area number 19 recognize visual information. But still we do not get idea or do not have meaningful uh, image related to these words. Now, how meaningful image and generation of idea occur? Now, this tertiary visual cortex, after recognizing these words, it communicate with your gyrins area. And through the gyrins area, it communicate information to Wernicke's area. And based on the past experience and learning, this Wernicke's area make meaningful image of horse in your mind. That's why Wernicke's area is called area of comprehension and interpretation. It is your verbal dictionary of the cerebrum. So basically, primary area receive information, secondary visual cortex analyze information, tertiary visual cortex recognize information, and that after recognition, visual information communicate to the gyrins area or gyrins area and Wernicke's area, and then you will get the meaning or image of the horse in your mind. And then this information from the Wernicke's area is going to the Broca's area. Okay. Now, in the same way, if I say horse rather than writing horse, if I say rose, let's say suppose I say rose, these words will be received in primary auditory cortex. Here is your primary auditory cortex, secondary auditory cortex, and tertiary auditory cortex. So, primary auditory cortex receive auditory information, then secondary auditory cortex analyzed based on past experiences, and tertiary auditory cortex actually hear but does not get meaning out of it. Tertiary based on the past experiences, this tertiary auditory cortex recognize your sound, the word rose, and then these word communicate with your this auditory information communicate to your Wernicke's area, and final image will appear in your mind. Final image of rose appear in your mind. Okay, clear? Now from this Wernicke's area, this sensory information goes to Broca's area, and this information goes to Exner's area, and from Broca's area and Exner's area, fibers projected to motor cortex. Okay, clear? Written speech, if I draw this, okay, this horse, the visual information of these written words through the visual pathway carried to primary, secondary, and tertiary visual cortex, where visual information is received, analyzed, and recognized. Then, after recognition, visual information through Gagarin's area and Wernicke's area. If I say some spoken words, rose, so that sound is initially received by primary auditory cortex, secondary auditory cortex, and tertiary auditory cortex. And through tertiary auditory cortex, this information goes to Wernicke's area, and from Wernicke's area, information goes to Broca's area and Exner's area. And Broca's area and Exner's area through projection connected to the premotor, primary motor and supplementary motor cortex. And from primary and premotor cortex and supplementary motor cortex, fibers goes down. These fibers are called, okay, these fibers controls motor nuclei present in brainstem. Now, suppose this is your fifth nerve. It has mesencephalic nucleus and spinal nucleus. These fibers of the fifth nerve goes and end up in trigeminal ganglia, which are responsible for, okay, trigeminal nerve supplies which muscles? Muscles of mastication. And these fibers, the fibers that are originating from premotor and primary motor cortex, they also control the seventh nerve nucleus. And seventh nerve is concerned with your muscle of facial expressions. Then another nucleus which is controlled by these fibers are ninth glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, and 10th cranial nerve which is vagus, and 12th cranial nerve which is hypoglossal nerve, and this hypoglossal nerve is responsible for the movement of tongue. Vagus nerve fibers supplies your muscles of pharynx and larynx and muscles of vocal cord. Okay, so the fibers that originate from cortex to the motor nuclei of the brainstem, these fibers are called corticonuclear fibers. Okay, these corticonuclear fibers control motor nuclei which are responsible for the production of the speech. Okay, so after receiving information from Wernicke's area, Broca's area gives signal to the neurons which are responsible for the production of speech. Main production of sound is done by larynx and vocal cord. Movement of the vocal cord produce sound, that is called phonation. And after production of sound by movement of the tongue or lips or muscles of soft palate and pharynx, by moving in particular manner, they produce different words, that is called articulation of sound or articulation of speech. So motor area, so Broca's area is also called expression of speech. Why? Because fibers from the Broca's area, they are projected to the motor cortex, which are responsible for the production of or the movement of muscle, which are responsible for production of speech. Okay. Now other fibers which originate from motor cortex also goes down and they control muscle of upper limb, which are responsible for writing. So corticonuclear fibers, or they are also called corticobulbar fibers, and medulla and pons are also called bulb. So the fibers that communicate from cortex, motor cortex to motor nuclei, they are called corticobulbar or corticonuclear fibers. The fibers that controls the movement of upper limb, they are called corticospinal fibers. So both these upper motor, corticonuclear and corticospinal fibers are controlled by Broca's area. That's why Broca's area is called speech expression. Remember, speech is not only spoken speech, but it is also a written speech. Speech has two types. Speech is of two types, written speech and spoken speech. Clear? Now, this cerebellum. What is the role of the cerebellum in speech? What is the main function of cerebellum? Main three core function: tone, posture and balance, and coordination. So here movement of the muscle of the speech is also coordinated by influencing this motor nuclei. So coordination of the speech is also done by cerebellum. Clear what we have learned today? First, what is language? Language is nothing but way of communication to an individual, either through words or spoken words, written words or spoken words. Which areas are responsible for production of speech? Wernicke's area, Broca's area, and arcuate fasciculus. The function of arcuate fasciculus is repetition of speech. Okay, Wernicke's area is area of comprehension and interpretation, whereas Broca's area is area of speech expression. Visual information, which is carried through the visual pathway, goes to the visual cortex and visual association area, and finally it is received to Wernicke's area, and through Wernicke's area, through bundle arcuate fasciculus, this sensory information goes to Broca's area, and after receiving sensory information from the Wernicke's area, Broca's area project this information to motor cortex, and finally speech is produced either in the spoken form or written form. Clear? This is the mechanism of development of speech. Now let's talk about applied aspect. Now there are three terminology for the difficulty in speech. First, okay, first is dysarthria. Cerebellum. Okay, there are three terminology. First is dysarthria, second is dysphonia, and third is aphasia. Dysarthria is lesion in cerebellum. So if there is lesion in cerebellum, there will be incoordination in speech. Patient cannot speak in coordinated manner. Speech will be incoordinated. So what is dysarthria? Dysarthria is due to the lesion in cerebellum. And what is dysarthria? It is the incoordination in speech. Okay. Second terminology is dysphonia. What is dysphonia? Main production of voice is called phonation, which is through expiration and through the movement of the vocal cord. So if there is problem in vocal cord or larynx or trachea or lungs, if there is problem in development of sound, that is called dysphonia. And third terminology is aphasia. What is aphasia? Now look, aphasia has three types: sensory aphasia, motor aphasia, and global aphasia. Aphasia has three types: sensory aphasia, motor aphasia, and third is global aphasia. So speech has main two component. First, understanding is done by Wernicke's area and expression is done by Broca's area. Now let's say, okay, Wernicke's area and Broca's area, and these are arcuate fasciculus. Now, if there is lesion in Wernicke's area, है ना, all the information of the visual cortex and auditory cortex is received by this Wernicke's area. If there is lesion in Wernicke's area, patient unable to comprehend or interpret visual and auditory information. Visual area is area of comprehension and interpretation. So if there is lesion in Wernicke's area, patient unable to understand written words or spoken words. But since this Broca's area is normal, speech expression is normal. Patient speak well, speak fluently, but it cannot make sense. Okay. So since all the sensory information from the Wernicke's area cannot communicate to Broca's area, this type of aphasia is called sensory aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia. Now here patient speak fluently. Here lesion in Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area is concerned with your comprehension and interpretation. So comprehension and interpretation is lost. Comprehension and interpretation is lost. But speech expression is normal. But speech is without any sense. Okay. So this type patient speak fluently but without making any sense. So that's why this is also called fluent aphasia. Okay. What is aphasia? First of all, what is aphasia? Aphasia means difficulty in speech, written speech or spoken speech, or difficulty in expressing, or both. Three type of aphasia: sensory aphasia, motor aphasia, and global aphasia. What is sensory aphasia? In sensory aphasia, lesion is in which area? Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is area of comprehension. So in this patient, comprehension will be lost, interpretation will be lost, but speech expression is normal. Patients speak but without making any sense. That's why it is called fluent aphasia. Why it is called fluent? Because speech patient is fluent. Patient can speak well, but without understanding, without interpreting visual and auditory information. So this is first type, sensory aphasia. What is motor aphasia? Second is motor aphasia. Now in motor aphasia, lesion is in Broca's area, but Wernicke's area is normal. So what happened in this patient? Patient understand visual information, patient comprehend visual information, patient understand auditory information, but patient cannot express well. So this aphasia is also called Broca's aphasia, or it is called non-fluent aphasia. Okay. Aphasia means either there is problem in understanding speech or expressing speech. Based on these, there are three types of aphasia. First is sensory aphasia, second is motor aphasia, and third is global aphasia. What happen in sensory aphasia? In sensory aphasia, patient unable to comprehend speech, written or spoken speech, but can express well. That's why it is also called fluent aphasia. Comprehension and interpretation is lost, but speech expression is normal. In motor aphasia or Broca's aphasia or non-fluent aphasia, patient unable to express. Patient can understand comprehension and interpretation. Here, comprehension and interpretation is intact, but speech expression is lost. And third type is global aphasia. In global aphasia, there is lesion in Wernicke's area, in Broca's area, as well as arcuate fasciculus. So what happened in global aphasia? Patient's comprehension, interpretation is lost, and patient cannot express as well. Speech expression will be lost. Here now three applied aspect related to speech. First is dysarthria. Dysarthria is incoordination in speech due to lesion in cerebellum. Second is dysphonia. In dysphonia, what happened? Difficulty in production of sound. And third, aphasia. What is aphasia? Aphasia is difficulty in understanding speech and expressing speech. Based on this, and depending on this, Wernicke's area and Broca's area, they can be divided into sensory aphasia, motor aphasia, and global aphasia. What is sensory aphasia? Lesion in Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area is area of comprehension. So comprehension will be lost, interpretation will be lost, but speech expression remain normal. If lesion is isolated in only in Wernicke's area. So when speech expression is normal, patient can speak fluently but without making any sense. That's why it is called fluent aphasia. Second type is motor aphasia, in which lesion is in Broca's area. So here motor component will be lost, speech expression is lost, but comprehension and interpretation is intact. In third type global aphasia, comprehension as well as speech expression will be lost, and that is called global aphasia. So this is all about speech, how speech is developed, what are the mechanism of speech, which are the component which are responsible for the production and articulation of speech, and finally applied aspect, dysarthria, dysphonia and aphasia. Okay, thank you.